Hello, welcome to a brand new day of free-to-play here on Magic the Gathering Arena. Get the dish on the latest with me, Lord Rumfish, and the latest is the Deckbuilding Toolbox series. So, I've been doing this series for a while now. I actually have covered every card in Standard, if you go back to the beginning, because I started by looking all the way back to, Innistrad, Midnight Hunt, Crimson Vow. The first video I covered a lot. This one is updating for Ixalan. We're going over white today. We'll start with the commons and uncommons and work our way to the rares and mythics. And the purpose of this series is to look at cards that give you a wide variety of tools for your toolbox when you want to build new decks. Right, so deck building is this creative process, and you just need access to tools. So it's good if you already have some things crafted and ready to go. If you, you can kind of recognize some of the kinds of decks and types of things you want to test out. So take everything I say through the lens of what you enjoy. And that being said, let's get started. Dusk Rose Reliquary. This is a 1-white artifact. As an additional cost to cast it, sacrifice an artifact or creature. So, it's very cheap in terms of mana, but it requires setup. It has Ward 2, so it's hard to target. And when it ETBs, you exile an artifact or creature an opponent controls until this leaves the battlefield. This is pretty good. This is, kind of your Oblivion Ring type effect. Doesn't hit every type of permanent. Just artifacts and creatures. That's a pretty wide swath of stuff, though. You cannot just put it into a control deck. You have to slot it into a deck that has things to sacrifice. Which, if you're doing an Aristocrats type of deck anyway, then this looks like a very strong card for it. Black has some similar things where you sacrifice something and it destroys or exiles a creature. Now this one also hits artifacts, so if you happen to be in white, could be a good pickup for that kind of deck. Market Gnome, speaking of Aristocrats type decks, that's where this card really wants a home. A 0/3 for 1 white mana that may or may not die at the time you want it to. It's normally kind of iffy for Standard, if every deck that you're ever going to play was aggro, then maybe. But if they exile it, you don't get the life gain in the card. But if you exile it using a craft ability, it still does its thing. So this can be for an Aristocrats deck. It can also be specifically for a craft deck. Craft deck's pretty narrow, but Aristocrats is more wide open. So this will like to call this one out here as an okay option at the right price. Ruin Lurker Bat. This is for life gain. Maybe for an aggressive strategy. Flying is evasive, life gain helps you win a damage race. This is about triggering your life gain cards. And it's pretty good at it. We've used 1/1 birds that didn't have the whole in-step descend scry one. It was just flying lifelinkers. So this has potential scries that it could give you. And overall, I think it's a pretty good creature. Certainly worthy of testing with. Clay-Fired Bricks, I love this one. I crafted it. It's been fantastic for me. I use it in white mid-range control decks. So on the front face of it, helps you hit your land drop, gives you a little bit of life gain to help offset, whatever aggressive strategy is happening. If you get around to the back face of it, which isn't even necessary, but it's an option, at some point down the line at sorcery speed, you can pay 7 mana, exile an artifact from your graveyard or in play, and you get the Cosmium Kiln. You get a pair of 1/1s, except they're 2/2s, because Creatures you control get +1/+1. This card, especially for its front face. Love it for its front face. But the back face has come up to already on standard on the ladder. This is great. This is a great card if you are in the kind of deck that wants to go a little long, delay a little bit, and get a lot of value. So give it a whirl. It's just an uncommon. Dauntless Dismantler. So this is a weird card. It's a good blocker. It's a 1/4 for 2. It's kind of a wall. Artifacts your opponent's control enter the battlefield tapped. Alright, that's somewhat narrow. It does come up. There are also artifact creatures that see play. Then you can pay a white XX, sacrifice this, and destroy each artifact with mana value X. And if you wanted... Now, it does exactly X. It doesn't do X or less. Right, so if you blow up artifacts that are equal to 1 or equal to 2, you don't do the ones that are less than that. Just exactly that. But I think this card is interesting for its utility to pay 1 white and blow up artifacts with mana value 0. Like blood tokens, or power stones, or gnomes, or a lot of things I could name. There are just a lot of little artifact tokens that run around in Standard, and for 1 white mana at instant speed, this can blow all of them up. Plus, it is a good blocker. A 1/4 for 2 is a good body for defense. I don't know exactly what deck wants this. I'm not exactly sure where this is going. But it's an off switch. It's kind of an off switch for aggro. It's an even bigger off switch for people who have a strategy that involves a lot of treasure or power stones or whatever. It's an interesting meta call. It's just an uncommon if you want to give it a try. Petrify. So we used to pay 3 mana for Arrest. Now it looks like we pay 2. Arrest might be able to hit other types of permanents, but this is just 2 mana, turns off artifacts and creatures. Not completely. It can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. It does not remove all abilities. It doesn't remove, like, triggered abilities. So, you can't petrify your opponent's Phyrexian Portal and expect it to not keep pulling back creatures from the graveyard. Still, for the price, for 2 mana, it's a pretty solid chunk of removal. Now, auras are not great, if the opponent's bouncing their permanents and such, but it'll stay on there if they're phasing them. Maybe you have a reason you want auras in your deck, and this is a pretty good piece of removal if you do. Oh, there's, that one card, Tutors, right? The guy who was like the protagonist of Wild's Veldrain. It's like there was a white adventure where you could fetch up an aura or an equipment, and then he was like a double striker when you played him. If you have stuff like this in your deck, he can tutor you up a piece of creature removal. And at 2 mana, this is pretty good. Vanguard of the Rose. I don't think this guy is amazing, but he's a 3/1 for 2. Vampire Knight, so checks a couple of boxes on creature types there. You can pay 1, sack another creature or artifact, gains indestructible until end of turn and tap it. If it didn't cost any mana, I think this card might see play in Standard. Since it does cost 1 mana, it's more niche. May or may not get there. But if you need a knight, or you need a vampire, or you need a 3/1 that can turn indestructible, a source of artifact sacrifice, it's at least a card to consider. Kanjali's Dawn Runner. So this is a double striker, and it explores when it enters the battlefield. So the Exploring can be a source of card advantage, right? If the top card of your library is a land, it goes right into your hand. If it's not, then you have a 2/2 double striker for 3, and you have the option to put that top card in the graveyard. Now, I don't think this card's amazing, and I don't think it quite gets there, but it's interesting. So, if it's one you want to experiment with, then give it a try. Mischievous Pup, I think this is better than it looks. This is a 3/1 with flash, so can be a surprise blocker. When it ETBs, return up to one other target permanent you control to its owner's hand. And white has some great options of things to bounce back to your hand. You know, if you've got stuff hanging around on the battlefield like clay-fired bricks, or you know, wedding announcement, whatever, you can pick those things back up and reset them, and you still get your flash blocker. If you don't need it as a flash blocker, then it can be a flash attacker. Anyway, if you have the kind of stuff in your deck, like clay-fired bricks, that are going to net you advantage when you play the Mischievous Pup, then it makes more sense to play it in that kind of a deck. But as far as the stuff it combos with, it's a long list. And once you get outside of white, it's sky's the limit. So it's up to you if you want to give the Mischievous Pup a try. All-Tech Archaeologists. It's a 4/4 for 5. When it ETBs, you can return an artifact from your graveyard to your hand. So that's an interesting proactive thing you could try to do with this card. Or you could scry 3. Not real excited about the scry 3, but if you had nothing better to do, scry 3 is quite a dig to try to find an answer, the next card you need. So I don't think this card is amazing, but if you did have an artifact deck that had white, then you could run maybe 1 or 2 copies of this up at the 5-drop slot as a way to get another threat onto the field and keep your cards churning. Keep, you know, the advantage kicking. Bring something back from the graveyard, do it over again. Maybe it's a clay-fired bricks. You find another land. Now you gain 2 more life. Now you can craft it into the Cosmium Kiln. So this card probably doesn't quite get there, but if you're early on and you're building this kind of a theme deck, I think it'd be fine. You'll probably replace it with better cards later. And that's all part of the game. Malamet Warscribe. So this is just a 4/3 for 5, which is not great. When it ETBs, creatures you control get +2/+1 until end of turn. Yikes. That's a big overrun effect that's attached to a body. So if you don't manage to win the game that turn, you've still pushed more threat onto the table. So normally these type of cards that are like a sorcery or an instant or whatever, usually they're sorceries. They give your whole team a boost like +2/+1 or +2/+2, that kind of thing. Those kind of cards people don't like to run in standard because if you have a mismatch of what you draw, where your opponent has a lot of removal, and you just need more threats and more threats to keep pressuring them with, then a card that pumps your team is just a dead card in that situation, which is terrible. And it's just stuck in your hand, and what you need is a creature on the battlefield. This, even if you do not need the team pump effect, if all you need is a body, this alone makes it better than those team pump spells like instants and sorceries. Just by virtue of being a body. And for that reason, I think this card is better than it looks. And I think a lot of aggro decks don't go up to 5 drops, but you can adjust your curve to where you can have like 2 5 drops in your deck. They could both be Malamet Warscribe. The idea is that you run a couple more lands, And when you get to turn 5, you play the Malamet War Scribe and you just win the game. Now, this is a cat warrior, doesn't really play well with other, humans, soldiers, knights, whatever. But if you're pretty early in your career and you're just trying to cobble together an aggressive deck, yeah, you get a bunch of whatever your best, most aggressive creatures are, and you're, could be monocolor white, probably be best, but you can also go white-red, white-green, whatever. Make this the top end of your curve and just try to finish the game the turn you play it. And I do believe this card is better than it looks. Last card we're going to look at from the commons and uncommons is Soaring Sandwing. Now, if you're not aware, we have some better cards in Standard. If you just want this for the plane cycling, right? It's not just Clay-Fired Bricks. There are other cards. A very similar card to Clay-Fired Bricks is Ecologist Terrarium. And then in white, there's a Samurai that you can discard as a channel ability. It finds you a plains and gains you 2 life. Very similar card to this one. I believe that one's a 4/4 with Vigilance. Green has a big 7 mana rare that for a green and 1 you can cycle it to gain 3 life. Anyway, there are a number of cards that you can pay some mana into, find a land, or find specifically a plains. So this card has competition. This card has some stiff competition in Standard just for that kind of slot in your deck. So the real question to ask here is, would you rather them be creatures? Do you have a plan to reanimate like every creature out of your graveyard? And if you do, cards like this that you can just cycle for value while you keep finding more lands, getting up to your critical threshold, then maybe you bring all the creatures back from your graveyard at the same time. I'm saying this could have a deck somewhere. And if you have a small collection, this could also be a useful glue card, much in the way that Clay-Fired Bricks is. It has kind of a, vaguely similar play to Clay-Fired Bricks. This turns into a team pump and a couple of little creatures, if you manage to do its thing later for 7 mana. And it requires another artifact. This one, later in the game, you just get a reasonable-sized flyer that gains you life, which is not amazing, but it's not nothing. So it kind of depends on what you're trying to do and the size of your collection, but I think it's alright. It's an alright card. And I guess if you had dinosaur synergies and you want to fill up your graveyard, maybe. Okay. Craft a few cards. On to the white rares and mythics. You may have seen this on the ladder already. Warden of the Inner Sky. People are trying this out in aggressive decks. So it's a 1/2 human soldier. The creature types are good. If this has 3 or more counters on it, it has flying and vigilance. They don't have to be +1/+1 counters, but that's probably what they're going to be. Tap 3 untapped artifacts and or creatures you control. Put a +1/+1 counter on this card. Scry 1, only as a sorcery. If it was at instant speed, it would be utterly broken. Because you could leave all your stuff up ready to block, attack with all your vigilant creatures. End of the opponent's turn do this, that would be crazy. As it is, it makes you commit to doing it on your turn, which turns out is still pretty good. You can tap a bunch of stuff that has Summoning Sickness, and tokens, and artifact tokens, and get your scries and get your counters. It's a little bit of an all-in strategy. It kind of makes you play into a board sweeper a little bit when you do that, but if the opponent can't deal, then you can put a lot of power and toughness onto the field very quickly with this card. So I won't I mean, you kind of know for yourself if you enjoy a go wide white strategy, maybe with some tokens thrown in there. So you know if you want to craft this for your aggro deck or not. I'm not going to tell you to craft it. There are a lot of great options for different aggro creatures, but this is one. It's not bad. Alright, Fabrication Foundry. This is neat. This is actually ramp. And it's not just finding you a plains, it is getting you up on mana, on 2. It's an artifact for 2. Takes white, makes white, but you can only spend it on an artifact spell or an activated ability of an artifact source. So it's kind of even more restrictive than a Power Stone. Power Stones, you can sink them into other activated abilities, or you can pay for like counterspell taxes and other stuff with that. Not so with this. This is a very narrow card that demands that you have an artifact deck. So, I can't recommend it for the toolbox for that reason, but I still think it's neat. It's a neat card. It's a powerful effect if you can get it to all gel and work together. And it could be a lot of ramp. You know, run like 4 of this, and then you run the other little legendary artifact for 2, taps for a colorless. And you're starting to really run away with mana generation at that point and get up to the big crazy artifacts pretty quickly. The other thing this can do, so you pay a white and 2, tap, exile 1 or more other artifacts you control with total mana value X. You return target artifact card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. You only do this as a sorcery. That's neat. That's really neat. I can think of some good use case scenarios for this kind of thing, you know. You can get down artifacts that give you value already. As they're entering the battlefield, they're drawing you cards, they're finding you lands, they're killing the opponent's creatures. We have artifacts that do all those things. Then you can exile those artifacts, maybe even tap them for the mana to activate this card, and you can regrow artifacts back from your graveyard. Now, it is a cost to do this, but you might be getting enough back in return that you're kind of staying ahead. This is a really neat card. I think as long as people don't run too many farewells, then this could make an interesting deck. But it's for a very narrow, very specific kind of deck. So I'm not going to tell you to craft it. I will tell you to craft Get Lost. I did. I've already made 2 copies of it. So, instant speed. You can destroy a creature, enchantment, or planeswalker. That's a good spread of things to blow up. Planeswalkers can be particularly irksome to try to get rid of, so it's nice to hold something back to blow it up. Also, instant speed removal is good for blowing up creature lands that you might not otherwise be able to get rid of. Now, its controller makes 2 map tokens. The map tokens can be activated at sorcery speed. So if you wait till the opponent's turn and you do this in the middle of combat, the map tokens don't affect combat that turn. You should watch out for using this at sorcery speed on your turn, because then they can use the map tokens to pump up another creature that they get out, and could end up being kind of a questionable decision at that point. So timing, I would say, is important with Get Lost, but overall, good card. I wouldn't be surprised if I end up going all the way to 4 copies with this at some point. Sanguine Evangelist. 2/1. Battle Cry. Man, I haven't seen Battle Cry in a while. Whenever this creature attacks, each other attacking creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. And when this enters the battlefield or dies, you make a 1/1 black bat, creature token with flying. So, a couple of things here. First of all, this is a pretty reasonable, body on the field. It puts out 2 creatures, 3 total power, and technically 4 total power when this attacks because the battle get +1 power. So, yeah, all of that's reasonable. Not amazing or anything, but it's reasonable. When it dies, you get another bat. So, gives you a little bit of insurance against board sweepers that are not exile-based. Which, unfortunately, exile sweepers are kind of a thing. But another thing about this card is it's good for aristocrats. You can sacrifice the bat, you can sacrifice the evangelist, and then it gives you another bat. So this one card represents 3 creatures you can sacrifice. On top of all that, it's a vampire and it's a cleric. And both of those actually have some relevance as creature types in Standard. Now, does all of that, it's all of that periphery, all those peripherals, mean that this card is good enough? I really don't know. It reminds me a little bit of a black card from a while back in Strixhaven that could make a pest token, could also exile the opponent's graveyard, or I think it could draw you a card and lose you a life. It was a 2/1 for 3. This one's a little bit more focused. This one is focused on producing creatures and being a bit more aggressive with its battle cry. I'm not sure what to tell you. I think if you like those styles of decks, it's worth testing. I think it's even possible it's worth testing in aggro. Now the turn has to make it all the way back around to you, unless you can give this haste. But if it gets all the way back around to your turn, this can swing in with Battle Cry, and at that point, maybe you've gone wide enough the opponent can't stop you. Has better things to block than the Evangelist at that point. I think it's worth testing. I think it's a pretty reasonable rare. It's not super exciting, it's not the sexiest rare, but it might get there. Alright, Resplendent Angel. And I've got the Ixalan art for it down here as well. These are my M19 copies. This is a good card. It is a solid threat unto itself, 3/3 flyer for 3. Respectable. If you can engineer it to where the turn you play it, you've gained 5 life, then it puts out 7 flying power. The token even has vigilance. If you can set up that situation to occur the turn that you play this, the opponent kind of really needs a board sweeper. And this card, by itself, you can pump 6 mana into it at instant speed, then it becomes a 5/5 flyer with lifelink, which means it can trigger itself for its own ability. And this is the kind of card that, after a board sweeper, you can play this onto an empty board, and now the opponent's under threat. If you're going to get up to 6 mana the turn after that, then you're going to start snowballing, running away with the game again, even though the opponent just swept the battlefield. It is a good spell. You don't necessarily need all 4 copies of it, but I wouldn't fault you for trying it at all 4 copies. just very solid all the way around. It's from a reprint from a different standard, but I still feel like if you get it to work, that it'll work for this standard too. I like it. The Alson Moon Smithy. This doesn't slot into just any deck, but works with creatures or artifacts. So when it ETBs, you get a Gnome Soldier artifact creature token. It has power and toughness equal to the number of artifacts and or creatures you control. That could be big. That could be a lot. Especially once you have treasure and blood tokens and other things running around. And at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you may tap 5 untapped artifacts and or creatures you control, and if you do, transform this. And if you have the ability to do that, you should. Because you get this legendary land that makes white. And whenever you cast an artifact or creature spell using mana from this land, you make another one of those Gnome Soldiers. It's just backbreaking. You know, at that point, the opponent really needs to get land destruction. If they can't blow up your Barracks of the Thousand, it's going to be a problem for the rest of the game with like every spell you played, because probably if you've made this deck, just about every spell in the deck is going to be an artifact or a creature. So I like this, and I think it's good. I don't know that an aggro deck wants it, because it's like you're not winning the game on turn 4 when you play it. You're sort of winning later. And this actually wants you to tap 5 things to flip it. And that's not what the aggro deck wants to do. So I think this is for a slightly different kind of mid-rangey deck. But your mileage may vary. I think it's definitely worth testing out. Abuelo's Awakening. This is neat. This pulls an artifact or an enchantment that's not an aura from your graveyard to the battlefield. You put X +1/+1 counters on it if you want to pay mana into X. And whatever you've pulled back is a 1/1 spirit creature with flying in addition to its other types. So it's fragile, but that doesn't matter if it's, you know, like a Phyrexian Portal or something that has, you know, a big enters the battlefield trigger when it comes in. Because then it's done its thing, really. And then it's, you know, maybe the opponent kills it, and then it's back in your graveyard again to pull back out with another copy of this, maybe. So basically you can reanimate artifacts and enchantments that are not auras into little flying creatures. And late in the game, maybe it's not so little. Maybe, you know, maybe it's a 5/5 or a 7/7 flyer if you have a lot of mana. But it could be as low as 4, and that makes it better than some of the other spells we have in Standard if all you want to do is just get it back onto the battlefield. I think this card is good, and people are sleeping on it right now. Finally, we have Unstable Glyph Bridge here. This is kind of a sweeper, but it's also kind of a game-ending threat. Let's take a look at it. So when this enters the battlefield, if you cast it, that's an interesting couple of clauses there, but I understand why they did it. Things that are an on-cast trigger have their own issues, and things that are just ETB triggers, you could flicker this and that would be problematic. So it has a pretty conservative wording there. But when it ETBs, if you cast it, for each player, choose a creature with power 2 or less that player controls. Then destroy all creatures except creatures chosen this way. If your opponent doesn't have any small creatures, then they're all destroyed. That's kind of interesting. There will be some matchups against, you know, ramp decks and other things where maybe they don't have a small creature, or maybe all that's left is like a little mana creature. And you can leave yourself a little critter as well. Basically, it's kind of, it's not quite as good as some of the other sweepers we have in Standard, I won't lie to you. It's better usually to just get rid of everything, and it's better to exile it or sacrifice it. And we have sweepers that do those things. But then, this is an artifact on the battlefield, and at sorcery speed, you can pay 5 to craft it with an artifact from your graveyard or in play. It turns into a Sand Swirl Wanderglyph, which is a 5/3 flyer. And just, let me point out, just on its own, a 5/3 flyer is a game-ending threat. The opponent very well may be able to kill it, but if they don't, a 5-power flyer is just going to... it's a very fast clock. It will end the game in short order. So the neat thing about this card to me is that it is a sweeper that is also stapled onto a threat. A win condition, if you will. There's other text over on this golem as well. Whenever an opponent casts a spell during their turn, they can't attack you or planeswalkers you control this turn. And each opponent who attacked you or a planeswalker you control this turn can't cast spells. So that's neat. Now, I guess if the only thing they attacked was a battle, then it wouldn't stop them from casting the battle. But if they attacked some of their creatures at you or a planeswalker and some of them at a battle, then I think the battle would fizzle on the other side when they attempted to cast it. It's an interesting bit of tech. It's like a super annoying bit of stuff that's added onto this card, in addition to it being a 5-power flyer that was attached to a board sweeper. So, it's weaker than the other sweepers we have in Standard, but is it worth it to get this 5/3 flyer that annoys the opponent? Maybe. I think it's worth testing. And that brings me to the point where I need to craft a couple of things. So, for my own toolbox here, I think I'm going to craft 2 rares and 1 mythic today. I'm curious whether Unstable Glyph Bridge is going to be worth it as a total package. You know, not taking in isolation that it's like a lackluster sweeper, but with the understanding that it's a sweeper, plus it's also an interesting creature. I'm going to try it out. I'm curious about Sanguine Evangelist. I really don't know if it's good enough, but the fact that it can make 2 additional bodies, and it has that battle cry stapled onto it, I feel like there's a wide variety of decks that could actually use this card, and I'm curious to try. I already have 2 copies of Resplendent Angel, but I always like to put my money where my mouth is on these crafting guides and spend, you know, a mythic for each color. This is the one that speaks to me the most. There's also the God for 6 that triples tokens and all of that. That one feels more difficult to pull off and has less my style. I'm going to craft this one. It's going to mess up my art. I have 2 different arts of Resplendent Angel. I'm doing it anyway. And there we go. Next time, we're going to jump in on blue. See what tools blue has in this new standard that is so hateful to counterspells. So, until then, please like, subscribe, you know, do the YouTube stuff, and never stop honing your critical thinking and empathy.